The 2024 Pro Farmer Crop Tour is presented by Pioneer, combining cutting-edge research with one of the largest local testing programs in the industry to help farmers succeed. Pioneer, what's next happens here. By Zetavo soybean seed, distributed exclusively by BASF, and by New Leaf Symbiotics, science-led, performance-driven, and data-backed, offering biostimulants for corn, soy, cotton, and peanuts, and a revolutionary new bioinsecticide for corn rootworm. The international sponsor for Crop Tour is the U.S. Soybean Export Council. Crop Tour 24 is also supported by RCIS, by Case IH, by Meristem Crop Performance, by Sweetwater Technologies, by Farm Credit Services of America, by Firestone, by Morton Buildings, by Nutrien ESN, and by BW Fusion.
Good evening. We've arrived at the end of Crop Tour 2024. Hello and welcome to Day 4 of Crop Tour Live. I'm Clinton Griffiths, the host of Ag Day and editor of Farm Journal Magazine. The two legs of the Pro Farmer Crop Tour, East and West, converging on Rochester, Minnesota. After finishing their survey of crops today in Iowa and Minnesota, scouts now gathered together to share a big meal, talk about all they've seen while anxiously awaiting tonight's results. Now, we're just minutes away from releasing the corn and soybean forecast for all of Iowa and Minnesota. But first, let's bring in our tour leaders again tonight, now seated together after beginning the tour 4 days ago on opposite ends of the Corn Belt. The leader of the Eastern Leg, Brian Grady, the editor of Pro Farmer, and from the West is the host of AgriTalk, Chip Flory. Fellas, thank you so much for joining us. I guess let's talk about today before we get too far ahead. What did you see today? And Chip, we'll start with you there in Minnesota.
Okay, Minnesota had a tough planting season and is having a tough growing season in general. The corn crop it's running out of gas. If they put on a fall applied nitrogen, it seems like that most of that nitrogen is gone at this point. Just way too much water for those guys to deal with and that corn crop to deal with. Now, see, the soybean crop, it seems to have handled the excess water better than what the corn crop has, to be honest with you. But it was just a really tough looking corn crop. The color stinks, the ear size stinks, and it's a tough crop up in Minnesota.
Brian, what about on the Iowa leg of the tour as you kind of put two sides together and then finish there in Rochester?
Yeah, so we heard from Chip about the western three districts last night. On the eastern side, the southeast is really good this year. East Central, it's good. It's really good. It's just not as good as the southeast. And then you get up in the northeastern portion, there's a lot of variability there. There's some good corn in northeast Iowa. There's some not so good corn in northeast Iowa. Soybeans are pretty heavily potted across the state, it seems like. So the soybeans are consistent, way more consistent than what we saw in the corn.
Now, Iowa is supposed to have a pretty big crop this year. Do you think there was enough out there to get it to the finish line of what kind of USDA was calling for, which was pretty huge?
Well, getting to the finish line, I think some of the crop, yes, it's already starting to dent and on its way. Some of the crop, as we got into northeastern portions, especially north of Highway 20, was pretty, the maturity lagged, to be honest with you. It needs some time yet. And so that's really the only portion of crop that we saw in a broad scale on the eastern side that needed time to finish. And it probably is going to get there, but we don't know for certain. And so there's a little uncertainty there.
Chip, obviously we got about 15 seconds here. Minnesota, maturity-wise, what do you think?
USDA had them unchanged from a year ago on the corn crop. There's no way that this is as good a crop as what we saw a year ago.
All right, well, the numbers are out. Let's go ahead and get started with Brian Grady. We'll start in Iowa this evening.
Absolutely. Corn crop, 192.79. That was up 5.5%. And it was a record for Crop Tour, besting what we pulled in 2021. On the soybean side of things, 1312.31, up 10.2%. And, like I said, just a heavily potted soybean crop in Iowa.
All right, Chip, in Minnesota.
Minnesota, the corn yield 164.9. That is down 9.07% from a year ago, and obviously not a record. And the Minnesota pod counts 1,036.59, up 5.3% from a year ago. So it's the number that surprises me the most after being out there and touring all day is the Minnesota pod count. I can't believe that it's above, up from a year ago. That really surprises me.
So as you go through those numbers, and we'll stick with soybeans here. 1,036. USDA's calling in their August report. They're looking for 49, which isn't a really big number. What do you like for chances of getting there?
Yeah, that 49 is up 2.1% from a year ago for USDA, and our pod counts are up 5.3%.
Okay.
You would think that would translate into ideas that this bean crop is going to be better than 49 bushels per acre, but don't make that mistake. Don't make that leap. The bean crop that we looked at a year ago had already done everything that it needed to do to build the yield. The trick then was to hold on to the yield through the end of the season. This year, that bean crop is still trying to put weight on it. It's still trying to build a yield, and it's got moisture, but it's just a different crop than what we looked at a year ago.
On the corn side of things, we've talked a little bit about that. Anything else on the Minnesota corn that you want to go through, Chip?
Well, it's problems that the guys experienced this spring that's showing up in a lot of ways, and it carried right into the heart of the growing season with some of those issues. But the corn crop just ran out of nitrogen. It ran out of fuel, and it's going to be, once this weather turns, it's going to be, the crop is going to be turning very quickly as well.
All right, Brian, let's skip back over to Iowa. And Chip, you did the western half of the state, so you jump in here and let's talk about these Iowa numbers. That's a pretty big number, 192.79. What do you think of this number? Good enough? What do you think?
Well, it's a record, so it's record good. But there are areas in the state that are spectacular. There are areas in the state that are somewhat lagging, and we'll see where it gets. But to pull a record, we've got 32 years of data, and for this to be a record, that says a lot.
Yes, it certainly does.
Chip, as you think back to yesterday and the western side of Iowa, there have been some tough spots that have kind of tugged and pulled on Iowa's yield the last couple of years. What do you think about this year?
Yeah, this year, Southwest Iowa is really good. West Central Iowa is even better. And the recovery that we got in West Central Iowa from a year ago, up about 16% on that corn yield in the West Central part of the state, Crop District 4, it's pretty phenomenal to see that much of an increase over a year ago. But the problems that we saw in Minnesota and that I've talked about, they started to show up in Northwest Iowa. And that's where the problem is in the state, I think, Beej. We're looking, Northwest Iowa is probably, it's down 3% from a year ago on the yield on corn. That's probably where the biggest problem is in the state.
And North Central too.
Yeah.
I think it's that same area that's plagued Minnesota.
Yeah. Yep.
Guys, we haven't really even talked about soybeans in Iowa, but we're up, by our numbers, 10% over last year's crop. 1,300 pods. USDA is looking for 61 bushels. There's got to be a pretty good crop out there.
Definitely, I think so. Moisture's there, a lot of pods. I guess this will be the test in terms of if we have a lot of pods, does it equal really big or record yields? And so it'll be put to the test this year.
Yeah, and it was something important about the Iowa bean crop. Yes, there are some diseases that are showing up. There's some white mold out there. The soybean cyst nematode problem out in western Iowa is real, okay? We can see it as we're driving through the state, and you see those yellowing spots on the side hills. A lot of that problem is SCN. So it's not a perfect crop in Iowa, but it's a doggone good one. I don't think there's any question about that.
All right, fellas. Well, Chip, you warned last night during Crop Tour Live that Minnesota could be a mess when it comes to conditions. Was he right? Ag Day's Michelle Rook followed scouts as they journey from Spencer, Iowa, and into Minnesota today and has our report.
Despite heavy rains and flooding here in southern Minnesota to start off the growing season, USDA is projecting corn yields for the state to be static with last year at 185 bushels per acre and a slight uptick in soybean yield to 49 BPA. But how does that compare to what Pro Farmer crop scouts are finding out here on the tour?
Field after field in southern Minnesota shows the scars from record-setting rains and flooding right after Father's Day.
In the county around here, from 19 to 30 inches of rain before the 1st of July.
Some farmers lost entire fields and most of holes within fields and yellow corn.
So there's some drown out spots where guys came back in and either planted just a cover crop or put in some early beans just to fill the hole essentially.
Telstra had just 12 inches of rain, but is still concerned about nitrogen loss on corn.
We just don't know how stuff's going to finish out with the leaching of our products out in the field.
To make things worse, Willer's crops are now drying out.
Now we're dealing with tip-back corn, like yay.
And that's not because of the heat.
And that's because of the drought on top of all that rain, yes.
That's also meant flat bean pods, and so yield potential on both crops may fall below his APH.
Looking like 175, 80, which we should have 2 1/4. And soybeans, I don't know. If we're lucky to get 50, and they should be 60 plus.
So achieving USDA's projected yields may be difficult, but what did crop scouts find in the fields on corn?
I mean, the ears are definitely smaller. This is probably one of the best ears we've seen here. This stop was in the 160s. Our first stop was 110, and then, it's been in between there.
And what about beans?
The first couple stops were a little bit low on the pod counts. You could tell that they were planted late. They'd had a lot of water. The plants were really thin, not a lot of pods, a lot of tubing pods, really flat yet. So just kind of immature and behind.
But the final results won't be known until harvest.
All right, thanks, Michelle. Now in the east, scouts headed out from Iowa City, finishing up through Iowa on their way to Rochester. Farm Journal's Tyne Morgan wrapping things up for us on that leg of the tour.
Last year on day 4 of Crop Tour here in the east, scouts were met with extremely high heat and the question of if Iowa's corn crop was drying down or dying down in the field. This year, they are lush green plants. And now the question is Iowa's corn crop actually better than Illinois?
As scouts hit the road for the final day of Crop Tour, they saw some issues from the wet weather this spring.
There's some tip back on them, though.
But for the most part,
they're good kernel count.
They were finding several fields of dreams in the east.
And usually you go through Iowa, especially, you'll have spots that just won't be the same. For whatever reason, some drought stress or whatnot, and this year it's just very consistent.
The theme for central, eastern, and southern Iowa this year is consistent corn yields.
We've been as high as 260. So the range is pretty consistently over 200 on this crop.
Much of that due to good grain length and more kernels around than past years.
I've seen a lot of 18s and a lot of 20s.
Zach Egglesdahl farms around Mason City, Iowa, an area of northern Iowa that was too wet this spring.
Last year we had a very good crop, a record crop in most spots. And this year we won't be there. We'll be off a solid probably 10 to 15%.
But in eastern and southern Iowa, the corn crop could be a record.
I think the potential is there from what we've seen so far.
11 plants.
Just like the first 3 days on the east, soybeans have been in the spotlight.
Illinois came out with a record soybean yield, and we saw a very similar story in Iowa. Pod counts have been good. Yesterday, our numbers were huge in Illinois and Iowa.
This set of scouts had one field with a pod count of only 600, but that was the outlier, as they've had some pod counts in the upper 2000s.
Iowa could have a record bean crop. Corn is, it's hard to say from my perspective, has been trending a lot higher than Illinois.
It's not just the high pod counts, but the fact that there's enough moisture for a strong finish this year.
Really only seen about one field with any sort of SDS pressure. Japanese beetles have been few, so to be able to take out some of those variables really helps.
These scouts didn't get into the trouble spots of northern Iowa that battled wet weather this spring, even forcing some farmers to take prevent plant. But from what they've seen, the garden spot just may be southeast Iowa this year.
We've kind of been short of the last 3 years on rain. We've had okay crops, but we've been a little short. My best crop was 2018, and I really think I had the potential to have a better crop than 2018 right now.
All right, thanks, Tyne. Now, Chip, Brian, scouts have surveyed all 7 states. You've been right there with them. Of course, we have to take these numbers, combine them. You're going to spend some time here trying to come up with some pro farmer numbers officially tomorrow. Talk to me about what from this week will go into consideration for coming up with those final numbers.
Well, absolutely. So we take all the data that we just collected over the last 4 days, and keep in mind everything that we've heard to this point, Monday through Thursday, is raw data from Crop Tour. Go into the fields, pull the samples, record it, put it into the spreadsheets, and it kicks out numbers. That's raw data. We take that raw data and then we add to it. We put analysis on it. We take into account all the areas outside of where we tour on Crop Tour, sample from on Crop Tour, weather, how we think it's going to finish, acreage adjustments, those types of things. Harvested acreage may come into play there. Just a multitude of factors. But that's Pro Farmer's number that's released at 1:30 Central Time tomorrow. Aside, it's different than Crop Tour.
Chip, how does this Crop Tour stack up for you? You've done this a couple of years now. Where does this one rank for you? It's been interesting from start to finish.
Oh, it really has been. When I think back over the years of doing this Crop Tour, the one that absolutely sticks out in my mind the most is the first one, 1993, because there was flood everywhere. So that's the one that really, really sticks in my mind. But this one was a good one. We had a good group of scouts out here. We got everybody from point A to point B 4 times, and we did it safely. And it's a good group that was out here. We pulled a nice number of samples, and so the diversity, and whenever you start talking about looking at the potential for a record crop in Iowa, a record yield in Iowa, a record yield in Illinois, absolutely. This one's going to be easy to remember.
What do you think, Brian? What are your takeaways from comparing this Crop Tour to previous Crop Tours, and what will you remember?
Well, probably my most memorable one is 2012 for obvious reasons. A lot of negatives with that one, but this one's the flip side. As bad as 2012 was, this one, it could be that good. And we just need another month to a month and a half of average weather in most cases. Some of it needs a little bit above average. Some can do with a little bit below average, but generally about a month and a half of average weather. And it's a matter of how many bushels we put into the bin at this point in time, because it's going to be a lot.
All right, gentlemen, appreciate you being here. Thank you for joining us all week on Crop Tour Live. We'll let you get back to the room to meet with folks there. And as you were saying, what is it going to take to bring these big crops to harvest? Could Mother Nature throw things for a loop? Well, the latest drought monitor just released today showing about 23% of the country currently in drought. That's a slight uptick from last week, but check out the topsoil moisture. Topsoil there. Other than Ohio, the Midwest looking much improved compared to last year, especially in Iowa. Subsoil moisture also up 13% overall from 2023. Now, USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey telling us today that should be enough to get these crops through the final weeks of the growing season.
Most of the meaningful rainfall should be associated with the southwestern monsoon circulation interacting with a series of weak cold fronts. What that means is that most of the rain showers should be primarily across the northwestern Corn Belt and mostly west of the Mississippi River. Pretty quiet as you head into the eastern areas.
As for temperatures, Rippey says they will begin to moderate as we move through the final days of this month, and we could see temperatures back into the 80s or even the 90s. But he says heat stress should be minimal. But this isn't the end for the numbers gathered on the tour. Tomorrow, Pro Farmer, as we mentioned, will release its national corn and soybean crop estimates, along with final estimates for each of the states visited on the tour. The new batch of numbers will factor in information gathered from the tour, along with other things, like Brian said, such as weather, crop maturity, historical differences from other tours, what USDA's forecast, and other areas outside of the tour. Now, Pro Farmer crunching those numbers this evening. You can look for those to be released tomorrow afternoon, 1:30 Central Time, over on agweb.com. Make sure to watch for those also in social media and at Pro Farmer. That wraps us up today for day 4 of Crop Tour Live. We want to thank all of our scouts, our tour organizers, production staff, and of course our sponsors for making this year's Pro Farmer Crop Tour such a success. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next year out on the tour.